Hello again. This time a little floral study from a rough sketch that I put together, which hopefully will finish up something like this towards the end. Start out with a very wet background with this particular painting. It's clear water, even though I've got a little bit of violet in the water, and that sort of helps me see where I'm going, because the first wash that goes over this will be a very strong violet, even though it will fade back as it dries, and we will reinforce it with other members of the similar colour family to gain the necessary contrast that we want against a dark background and some lightish flowers. There'll be a little bit of colour in the flower and the vase and so on, and we want a good strong contrast. So here we're just using a mix of violet and strengthening a little bit more paint, less water here, but we're working into a very wet background, so we can allow that wash to just flow into the wet paper. Pull it around here and there with the mop that I'm using. It's got a good point to it. I mean, not terribly fussed about the edges between the background and the flowers, because I want those flowers ultimately to have a fairly soft edge to them. I don't want them to be terribly hard and sharp edged, maybe to try and convey a little bit of the softness of the flower itself. And I don't want the edges of the flowers to be too orderly. Flowers don't grow by design necessarily. They just grow for themselves, and we should try and express them that way. Again, just reinforcing that initial wash, shaping out the vase in which the flowers sit, and we'll do more with that later on. There is going to be a fair amount of drying involved in something like this, especially with such a large wet area and so on to contend with initially. So we'll take our time and break every now and then for the drying. This floral design or whatever is something that I've done before. It doesn't represent anything particular. Just a nice shape for the vase, the jar, whatever it is, and just the flowers that are sitting quietly in there. Again, with some larger shapes and smaller shapes to try and tell a little bit of a story about that. Again, we're just adding a little bit of blue, a little bit of ultramarine, not a great deal. Just a touch around the base of the jar, a little bit of shadow underneath the flowers and so on. Now this again is for the most part underpainting. The stronger violet, you can see the background has dried back a lot now, and so we attack the background even further with a much stronger version of violet. Still quite wet, because we're now going over a dry surface, as you can see by the sharp edge on the initial brush strokes of the darker violet. We're not going all the way to the edge of the paper. We'll make a few shapes just to create a suggestion or two, a little bit of something happening behind the flowers. Again, I'm using the mop brush, loading it up fairly well, and using both the tip and the side of the brush to get the effects that I want. Scuff in a bit of colour here and there, and where I need a little bit of more exacting application. The mop has a good tip to it. This background we're putting in now is is nowhere near the final wash that we're going to put in here. We will find this will dry back as well. So we're going to put in a very, very strong contrasting background in behind the flowers and so on. That will give us a very strong light versus dark background. Now here we've got ultramarine blue in our violet, quite wet, allowing that to bleed into the wet wash that we just applied. We'll sort of confine this one a little closer to the bunch of flowers and get sort of in and under them where the shadows are going to be, and there's going to be further shapes with those in due course. When you're working with washes as wet as these, obviously if you don't want the colours to blend, you want them to stand proud of each other or contrast with each other, then you must let those washes dry. Here we've just got a little bit of cobalt teal, a good complement to the violet and so on. Again, it will dry back, it won't have that same intensity when it dries, but it helps the violet background to gain effect. Doesn't go everywhere. No, it's not necessary to go everywhere in the painting, just here and there, just for suggestive help. Now you can see that what we thought was quite a dark background has dried back. So now we'll attack the shadows closer to the flowers and so on, and we'll do that with some indigo, a little bit of neutral tint to make a very, very strong dark. Now this wash isn't quite as wet, so I can pull it around with the mop brush to gain effects of some of these spindly little sticks and things like that that are in the vase with the flowers. A few calligraphic style brush marks and so on, just to suggest leaves and sticks and stalks of things and so on. Quite strong, and with the paint as thick as I'm using it here, you're going to get a little bit of dry brush effect here and there, which is fine. A little bit of variety into the painting. We don't want the painting to look like a colouring book with lines everywhere and colour confined by black lines and things like that. We're trying to make the suggestion of a nicely arranged little vase of flowers and with a bit of energy in it. Shadows we find on the flowers when we get to there, they will be much softer and hopefully more suggestive of fairly soft petals in the flowers themselves. I've tried to show these flowers as each of them looking in a different direction for variety. Just drying out on me a little bit, so I'll just add a little bit of hazing water through the little spray bottle, and that will also give us a softer touch to the edges of the petals where they bound the very dark contrast and so on, and this is what we're after. We don't want that razor sharp edge at that point. The brush is just a little damp, hasn't got a lot of paint on it. Just using my pocket knife here, I'm just scratching a little bit of that paint away while it's still damp, just to give me a couple of little sticks and suggestions of twigs and things like that. Scraping or using a knife is an option that not everybody likes to use, but it can give you some nice effects if it's used in the right spot. Now just a little bit of light grey, just a very light grey blue. A lot of water, a little bit of French ultramarine, and a tiny touch of violet, but it's very, very light. And this will suggest some of the shadows that we want on the flowers themselves and under them, and as they bound each other and cast a bit of shadow onto the flower next to them. These areas are just to define a little better the shadows that the vase throws down onto whatever it is it's sitting on, and gives us a suggestion of the shape. The vase is intended to look like a glass vase, transparent, so we will need ultimately to bring in some of the darker background colour in on the other side of the vase, and I do that quite late in the piece with a glaze. You can see that we've just started to apply a little bit of colour to the flowers, a little bit of pink, orange for the inside parts of the flower. This is made up by some permanent rose and a little bit of orange, strong cad yellow if you don't have orange ready made, because it's going to be quite soft. We put the wash on and then we'll thin it with a bit of water and just spread it where we need it for effect. Just a little bit of colour into the flowers themselves, and also we'll have some on the reflection of the glass vase when we get that far. Just darken that wash a little bit as the inside part of the flower, which is not getting the light, and of course at the exterior edges and so on, of course that's where the light strikes more predominantly, and so we can leave that just the whiteness of the paper. Just a combination of these washes here and there. This colour is very close to a flesh colour, but quite light, and we do need to preserve the whiteness of the paper to complement it. This is all being done with a small Escoda, about size 6 sable. I only own a couple of sable brushes and so on, and for the most part I use synthetics, Escoda synthetics. Wonderful brushes, but these couple of sables were given to me, so I'll certainly give them a workout when the opportunity arises. Just strengthen a little bit of that colour here and there, just a little bit of light shining on the petals from somewhere. A little of that red orange just on the interior parts of the flower. We need to bring a little bit of shadow into the inside parts of the flower arrangement, where each shadow casts a little bit of each flower rather casts a little bit of shadow onto the flower next to it, and we just reinforce some of the internal parts here, just make them a wee bit stronger, a bit more noticeable. A little bit of cast shadow onto the petals of the flower just next to it, which gives it a bit of definition and also helps give the painting a small feeling of depth. Your shadows and your contrasts, etc., that you employ in any painting are there to virtually trick the eye of the viewer into thinking that there is depth, the third dimension, in the painting. Some things are further away than others, and this is the skill that we practice to try and bring these things forward and push others back in the composition. Just a little bit of darkness underneath the structure of that top flower. Something dark, a little bit of neutral tint, maybe a little bit of indigo, just to give us something dark for the central part of that flower which is facing us. The top one doesn't require much, if anything, just a little bit of shade underneath the flower. And again, we're just sort of roughing up the edges of these a little bit so that they don't look so much like the plastic flowers you buy in the cheap shops. We'll touch up the edges of these flowers with a little bit of liquid gouache a bit later on. Again, just to help the little bit of spontaneous appearance for the edges of the flowers. Here, a little bit of reflection from the flower down onto the glass vase, reinforcing the shape of the vase and hopefully where the light strikes it, and trying to preserve the feeling of transparency. I need to put some stalks from these flowers down into the vase before the painting is finished, and that'll come along a little later on when we put a glaze over the glass itself. Just a little bit of gouache being applied to the edges of some of these flowers and so on, and a few highlights here and there. We'll also put in a couple of just nondescript little whitish sort of blooms and so on, just to add a bit of scale to the composition, so that we haven't got just the 3 flowers on their own. There's a suggestion of 1 or 2 others in the composition at the background. It also helps the eye travel around it a bit more comfortably. Just on the curve of the vase where the light strikes, just a white line, and just on the outer edge where the light goes through the glass vase. You can see here that we've put the blue glaze over the glass and some stalks, and those flowers we spoke about up here, just a couple of nondescript little shapes to help out the overall composition. Like all the paintings that we do, there can be a terrible temptation to overwork them. I hope I haven't done it with this one, but I think that the composition is entitled to have a little bit of additional work and make me present something which is a little more like what my intention was in the first place. Flowers can be a lot of fun when you get them right, and they can be a real bother when you don't. I don't want to overdo this this highlight situation here. Just trying to pick up a couple of edges that I lost when we put the glaze over the top of the vase, and that's done by just a single wash, quite liquid, and just put on with just single strokes, just straight over and leave it go. And this is our finished product. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed.